Hey everyone, and welcome to another week of Political Capital. All the best in BC politics. We've got a ton to get to today, but thank you so much for being with us, subscribing on all the podcast feeds, wherever you purchase quality podcasts. I'm sure we are there. On the YouTubes, on Check Plus, where you can see all of the old episodes, and then watching us on Check TV on Sunday evening. So thank you so much for being here. We're going to bring in the panel because we got a bunch of stuff to talk about today, and none of it is about COVID. It's over. It's over. COVID is over. Unfurl the mission accomplished banner. Wait, I'm being told, no, it's not. Okay. But for this week, it is not a topic of discussion. We've got other things that we can actually talk about. So let's bring in the panel. Maclean K, editor of the Orca. Hello, Maclean. Thanks for being here.
And speaking of COVID, no, thank you. Always a pleasure.
You got COVID? Okay, cut his feet. Jillian Oliver, Green Strategist Extraordinaire. Hello, Jillian. Thank you for being here.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me.
And Katy Merrifield, Vice President of Wellington Advocacy. Hello, Katy.
Hi, Rob.
All right, let us jump into the first topic. And this was not even on anyone's radar until Thursday afternoon, actually Thursday midday, when a note came out from the Premier's press secretary. He will be in his office. He will be making a personal statement in 15 minutes. Please don't tell anyone this press conference is happening until it begins. He'll take one or two questions. I thought he was resigning, to be honest with you, because that's usually how you get a press release that comes out right before it happens, and it's a personal matter. It turns out that he has health concerns with a growth on his neck that turned into an examination and found a growth in his throat. So the Premier is undergoing a biopsy, which the results of which may be back by the time that you hear this. He's appointed a Deputy Premier, Mike Farnworth, in case he needs to take over the duties. And we're going to talk, first off, I think we're going to say, and I think we're all in agreement on this, that there's hopes that John Horgan gets, a very positive diagnosis and that his health improves, and that we're all wishing him well on that. There was a large outpouring of cross-partisan support from everyone in the building, hoping that that this turns into a positive diagnosis for him. We're going to talk a little bit about it, I think, because when the Premier of the province is facing something like this, it changes the dynamics of how his party is operating. It changes the dynamics of the opposition. The legislature is in session. What does this mean? What does it do? How do we kind of view it? Let's go around the table and just grab everyone's thoughts on this. Maclean, why don't we start with you? The Premier, clearly there was an outpouring of support here, and clearly everyone's hoping that he does well. But what does it mean for his party to have him facing a health challenge like this, do you think?
Well, hopefully his absence is very, very brief. One of the things he mentioned in his press conference, you alluded to it, is that he named Mike Farnworth, appointed Mike Farnworth as Deputy Premier. I think a lot of people didn't realize that we didn't have a Deputy Premier. As Horgan explained, that had been Carol James, and he thought, quite understandably, that, it would be hard for anyone to fill her shoes. But yesterday kind of showed the importance of having someone who's there and, nominated to be the person who steps in case, God forbid, something happens. And so, I mean, I think most people would agree he made the right choice in Mike Farnworth, but the province will continue to move along seamlessly, and so will government. He is the Premier and the President of the Executive Council, but the cabinet is still there. Mike Farnworth will be the first among equals at that table now for a short period of time. And I mean, there's every indication that hopefully he'll be back very soon. This is not an extended absence, we hope.
Mm-hmm. Katy, you've advised, a couple of premiers in senior positions. What happens to a government, or to the way that it functions, to the politics, to the cabinet, when a premier is kind of undergoing a personal issue that takes him away from the job in the way that other people have known him to do it for a short while?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the most important thing is business as usual, continue the operations of government as best as possible. And I can think of nobody better than, I think, universally beloved Mike Farnworth, who is a, I think, 30-year plus veteran of the legislature. So I agree that he was absolutely the right choice. I want to talk about Horgan's message. I thought that his message on social media was particularly well framed and quite on brand. When he said, I've been here before and I'm not alone. People across BC receive news like this every day. I thought that was really humble and also recognized the struggles facing everyday British Columbians. So a difficult message to convey, but I did want to acknowledge that I thought that was quite smart. Let's talk about like implications for the other parties, because on the surface it may seem like, okay, well, now what? Obviously, opposition parties, aren't going to invoke Horgan's name anymore. That is going to appear quite heartless and rather ill-conceived. But my message is like the opposition parties still need to hold the government to account. So sub this government, the NDP. For Horgan, go after ministers you think that are weak. Go after ministers that you think one day might be in a leadership race. I know this may sound a little bit callous, but if you want an effective opposition, look no further than next door with Rachel Notley, right? She would not let a premier's critical illness get in her way. That's for sure.
Yeah, well, the legislature did operate Thursday afternoon with the debates, line by line debate on the FOI bill, and you're right, it did return to a bit of normalcy with the opposition able to go after Citizen Services Minister Lisa Bear without kind of the awkwardness of the invoking the premier's name when he's suffering a health issue. But Jillian, what do you think will happen? I mean, there has been gains made by the opposition parties the last few weeks on the health dome response, the heat dome response in the healthcare system, the ambulance delays, FOI, other things that they deliberately tagged John Horgan's name in every question. They went after him when he wasn't even there in the House. That strategy doesn't seem like it's a very good one going forward. But how do the opposition parties react in the legislature function, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. And, there's a good strategic reason why opposition parties do that. It's because people identify much more with other people, with political figures, individual political figures, rather than kind of the abstract notion of a party, even though we don't vote for leaders directly in our political system. But yeah, I think that, I would imagine actually that these conversations about how to sort of shift framing from Horgan to the NDP have already been underway because of what we talked about a couple of weeks ago, because there's rumors that the premier may not run again. So I think this probably just accelerates it for the opposition parties. Like Katy and Maclean said, there's still a cabinet that's fully accountable. We're in the middle of a legislative session. So I think it's a little bit of tweaking in terms of, who they go after and how they frame things, but not in terms of how they're framing the government as a whole and the job that it's doing.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think internally within the NDP, and we talked about it a couple of weeks ago, there was already that question of John Horgan, 62. Is this his fifth term? It's possible he doesn't run again anyways. I'm sure this health concern factors into the discussion he's having with his family about that, whether he is able to mount a full recovery, which we hope he does or not. It probably adds another consideration that he's making on that. So the party will have to deal with that, and we'll see. If he does choose to step down at some point, it would be the NDP caucus that would select an interim leader, who would then be the interim premier, and then the party would have a leadership race to find a full leader. And the timeline of all of that we're not there yet, but there's a timeline there that could take us up to the next election. So we will watch that. Before we got news of the premier's health issue, he did have a press conference to start the week off on BC's new climate plan, Climate Plan 2.0, as we're sort of referring to it. It's a kind of revisit of the 2018 climate plan from government to fill in some of the targets, some of the path to the targets for 2030 that were left kind of undiscussed at the time. Jillian, let's start with you on that. There's reaction all over the place. Different environmental groups are pleased and unhappy with parts of it. Goals that aren't quite set or targets that aren't quite met. What did you think of how government handled this and the sort of the reaction that's out there?
Yeah, well, I think, looking at the plan itself, there is a lot of good stuff in there. There's some really great stuff on transportation and urban planning that's going to be really transformative, not just for reducing emissions, but also for, I think, improving quality of life for people. Some stuff that will make a big difference, like expanding the low carbon fuel standard to include marine and aviation fuels, which is a big deal. A cap on natural gas utilities. So that's the gas that we use to heat our homes, which will be cut almost in half, which is also a very big deal. But then there's stuff not to like as well. And most notably, the environmentalists picked up on the fact that the government is still subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, that they have, deferred making a decision on deferrals of old growth forest logging because it's related to climate change, because old growth forests are very productive in terms of capturing carbon from the air. And the fact that a lot of this plan is about encouraging industry to make changes rather than mandating it. And so a lot of what's in the plan still has to be negotiated with industry. And that was one thing that environmentalists really didn't like, because they feel a huge sense of urgency. There's the big international COP26 climate conference coming up this week. The UN just released their Code Red report. So it's very much an emergency situation in terms of the climate crisis. And I think the view of folks working on climate advocacy was that this doesn't quite meet the challenge. Somebody said to me that worked in climate policy that if this was released 10 years ago, it would be an absolutely amazing home run, but it just doesn't fully meet the urgency of the situation. So yeah, I think that's why we saw the response that we did.
Jillian, you were with the Greens when, it was part of CASA when the first climate plan came out. It was a promise to get back to the public with the missing 25% of targets to get to the 2030 target. Now it's come back, and as you mentioned, with the oil and gas sector, a plan to come up with a plan by 2023. Is that timeline acceptable, do you think? Just to go back to you on that, as another couple of years to come up with that plan for a government that's been in place for 4 years? That's a 6-year plan to reach 2030. It'll give them 6.5, 7 more years to get there. Does that timeline make sense to you?
I mean, I think, it's the biggest thing that kind of undercuts the plan, because these are not subsidies that were put in by a previous government. These are subsidies that the NDP brought in just 2 or 3 years ago. They're really new, and now they're saying they're going to go back and review them. So I think that it undercuts trust, I think, in the minds of folks advocating for change on this issue and pushing for more, because it was the government itself that did it. So, and I think, those subsidies that the NDP put in were to secure LNG Canada were much more generous than what the Liberals had offered. And I think that sends a signal that they might not be willing to be the hard-nosed negotiators that are required to sort of get industry on side with a plan like this.
Yeah. Katy, I was struck when I was watching it about how much effort government has put into this plan, this climate plan, and they announced it, and they thought on its own people would be talking about it. But some things that we've been talking about the last few weeks, old growth, forests, and subsidizing natural gas production, they kind of undercut the message. And it seemed to me one of those maybe cautionary tales of big announcements government hope are viewed in isolation, but they got the lingering smaller things that come along and take it out at the knees. I don't know if you saw that or wondered about that as well.
I think here in BC, it's imperative for the government in power to strike a balance. You want to be seen as a climate change leader. It is one of the most pressing issues, if not the most, of our day. But you can't ignore the importance of responsible resource development, right? This brings in 2.7 billion annually, I think, into the BC budget, and employs about 30,000 people. And I think you could see the balance that they were seeking in the series of endorsements in the news release. They had credible academics like Mark Jacquard, environmental leaders like Karen Tam-Wu and Marin Smith. They had Andrew Weaver there as a big FU to the Greens. And then on the industry side, they had the new car dealers, the COFI, and the mining and cement associations. So in terms of balancing environmental needs as well as protecting industry, I think they saw what they were achieving, or they achieved what they sought to do there. The most valid criticism I saw was actually nonpartisan. I think it was in Global, and they said that, look, this is an aspirational plan that frequently lacks specifics, and making targets for 10, 20 years from now is actually quite easy. There's no guarantee that you'll still be in government. So I think, to Jillian's point, the proof is going to be in the pudding. It's not the plan that they have laid out on paper. It's are they going to achieve these deliverables in a timely fashion?
Yeah, that's a fascinating point, listening to stakeholders. So I think you're right. That's very much the modern NDP. Is they're trying to hold that group, and if the environmental groups are upset, they're not as worried about that as they used to be, as they are trying to get the list of stakeholders that you read to be on board with a plan. Maclean, sorry, go ahead.
I would be remiss if I didn't remind folks that BC Liberals have really been the leaders on climate change in this province, right? Let's not forget they brought in the revenue neutral carbon tax over a decade ago before it was trendy, and the NDP voted against that. Okay, now I'm done.
Sure, although the other part of all of that is that I think BC has hit, and let me just check the spreadsheet here, 0 of its climate goals since we started talking about climate change. Spent years talking about a carbon tax, and the day that this came out, this new climate plan, we got the GHG reports that showed that emissions are up 5% in the most recent year. So we've never, ever, despite talking about it for like 16, 18 years, actually brought pollution levels down, which is kind of fascinating to me that all these plans and taxes and talk and electric cars and discussion, and we're still not trending in the correct direction at all. Maclean, what did you think of all this?
Well, I mean, to your point about not meeting our targets, no less than Environment Minister George Heyman was saying that, well, BC is 1/10 of 1% of global emissions, and so even if we shut down the province tomorrow, doesn't make a difference. Which is, I mean, true, but also surprising coming from him, given his background with the Sierra Club and organizations like that. I think that he would have been among those saying, well, this isn't enough if another government was in power. But the problem is he's right, and so was Andrew Weaver when he said that, well, I don't know that 1.5 degrees is attainable anymore. The numbers make that look pretty certain, and he was roundly criticized as giving up hope. But if it's stating a fact, it's stating a fact. The problem we have with climate change is not just that it's happening, is that we're completely powerless to affect it here in BC and even Canada. Just this week, the story we're not talking about is China is rapidly expanding coal production. And that is going to make a much bigger difference than anything we could do in Canada several times over. And so the biggest difference we can make in climate change is, yes, leadership and symbolic gestures, sure, but also helping the big emitters reduce their emissions. And if we can't do that, then, what are we even doing here?
Yeah, I mean, that opens up a whole nother discussion about LNG and whether that's accommodated within this plan, which it theoretically is, but not an expansion of it. And it could go on and on. But it is a question for sure, and something the government's going to have to wrestle with as it tackles this. We got enough time to hit our last topic here, which is that we were talking about Climate Plan 2.0. Now we're into FOI Fight 2.0. Last week we talked about the FOI bill. This week we kind of got the dose of reality from government on it, not talking about it, not putting up any speakers, not addressing an amendment, just kind of bigfooting this thing all the way through the legislature all week, and John Horgan kind of continuing to say, well, who cares about this file? Is there anything, without getting into the weeds on FOI, is there anything we see or learn about government from the way that they're handling this bill? Let's go back to you, Maclean, and we'll go around that way.
I mean, I think the NDP sort of told us themselves. This is kind of driven a little bit by spite. They are sick of what they call fishing expeditions from the opposition BC Liberals and from Bob Mackin, who they named specifically. And despite the very real fact that they themselves did so in opposition, to great effect and to their credit, now that the shoe is quite literally on the other foot, they are deciding that the rules need to change. And the fact that they're not even willing to defend it shows that they think that people don't care, and if they do, they won't remember 3 years from now.
Yeah.
But I think that anytime you're picking a fight with the media, that's not an issue that's going to go away.
But Katie, that when you have a majority government and you have a difficult file in the legislature, why not just get it through as fast as you can and not talk? Don't get stuck talking about, principles in the legislature where no one's paying any attention. I don't know. I mean, there's a callousness of it that makes total sense politically as well.
You're 100% correct. It goes back to my golden rule, which is nobody gives an F what happens in the legislature. Like the pros to this strategy, like you have a majority government, use it. Use all of the tools in the legislature at your disposal. Invoke closure if you have to. Ignore the cries of your opponents. Just get stuff done.
Show no mercy.
This is why parties fight for majority governments. It's so they can swiftly and sometimes brutally implement their agendas. Is this kind? Is this thoughtful? Is it exceptionally democratic? No. But to what has been said, I bet not a single person in the next election is going to say, remember that time the NDP ignored an amendment, like on that FOI bill? It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, but it is.
I get passionate about this because I fought people that I've advised in this subject matter.
and to Katie's point about the silence, I mean, sometimes it's better not to defend the indefensible, because then you just look ridiculous. Sometimes silence and just looking callous is better than saying something transparently wrong, which can
Answer
then be memed
forever.
Exactly, and even out of context.
But then to flip that back, though, I mean, this is exactly the kind of arrogant bigfooting of the legislature that John Horgan used to hate in opposition. The mistreatment, the just kind of callousness of it, Jillian. Now to watch him do it, and his government to do it, and to use all the same tools that they hated to push through a bill that no one seems to want except them, is the ultimate example of hypocrisy, I think.
Yeah, and I think, we actually, although the public is not watching what's going on in the legislature, I think we are starting to see this spill out into stakeholder groups that might affect the NDP a little bit more long term. I talked about, how it's not a good idea to tick off the media last time, but we saw a letter that was signed by a lot of traditional US allies, or sorry, NDP allies, and, the BCGEU, saying, making the point that this isn't just the consequences under your government, it's for future governments as well, that will be able to set a fee of whatever they want for freedom of information requests. And so I think that it does sort of generate a little bit of cynicism and start to affect some of those relationships which parties rely on come election time to help them organize and to validate them. So I do see some consequences down the road if it's not handled well on that side.
Yeah, for sure. Down the road, someone will be able to use this stuff in an attack ad at some point. It's just not enough on its own to be meaningful to swing votes this far away from an election on an issue that no one's ever going to vote on anyways. But it does tell us something about the NDP growing up and using that majority that they have to become the kind of party that they always hated. but is governing that way for a reason, as Katy pointed out. When you have the majority, you do this because you're executing your agenda, even if the only one who believes in that agenda is you, because there's a giant pile of critics on the side who say this is the wrong move. But anyways, we got just enough time to do a very quick hot take here. We're going to go around. It's Halloween. I'm not going to ask you what you're dressing up as. My daughter went as a vaccine card, so I thought that was... I tried to make her a zombie vaccine card, but she just wanted to do the vaccine card. But anyways, Halloween, your favorite Halloween candy. Let's quickly go around. Maclean?
Reese peanut butter cups all day, every day.
Oh, disgusting. Katy, go ahead.
Maclean does have my favorite, but I'm going to give a shout out to anyone who gives out chips. That's a wise culinary move. Balance the sweet out with some salty.
Yeah, not those people who give you like the apple. I don't think you can give candy apples out during COVID anyways. It needs to be packaged. That's not cool. Jillian?
I have already been digging into the Snickers that I bought to hand out to children.
Nice.
So that's my favorite.
I'm tempted. Avoid Jillian's house, children of Nelson.
Yeah,
the good stuff's taken.
I'm tempted to say the Aero bar just so our producer Kyle can cut our feed, because it doesn't make any sense to insert air into a chocolate bar, and I totally agree with him. So not Aero bar, but I do enjoy the Smarties, getting the little Smartie packs, and then as a kid pretending to do a shooter of all the Smarties at once. I always thought that was pretty cool. Anyways, thank you so much for watching us. We'll be back next week with all the latest on political capital. Make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you then.